Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today I need to sew a button on my husband's shorts. I've had them long enough, summer's almost over, I better get that button on. Now there are many ways you can sew on your buttons. You can sew them on by hand, and you can also sew them on by machine. When you sew them on my machine, you can use a regular zigzag foot, or if your machine, like my Baby Lock, has a special foot that actually will hold the button as you sew it on, this is kind of nice too. And there's so many different types of buttons, ball buttons, flat buttons. So what we're going to do is, this is going to be a two-part video, and the first one we're going to cover the different types of buttons and how to hand sew the button back on a garment. The second episode, we're going to hit the machines, and I'm going to show you how to do it on the machines. After all, if we can have our machine do it, why not? But let's start today and get sewing the buttons on by hand, and let's learn a little bit about the buttons. Now when you sew a button on, all buttons must have a shank, or that is the space between the button and the fabric, so that the buttonhole can fit in there. So it's very important that you have that space so that you don't have the pressure on the button. Let me show you. Now there are many different flat buttons, and you can tell they're flat because they literally are flat. Then there are many buttons that have the pre-built shaft in them. They're called shaft buttons or ball buttons. And you can see that they have shafts because they're raised off of the surface. And some buttons are confusing buttons. This one does have the shaft because the fabric, there is a space for the fabric to go in between. This one also, when it is sewn onto the garment, there is a space for the buttonhole. And this one seems very flat, but if you look at it, it has a tiny little shaft right here. And this one also has a built-in shaft. Even though it looks like it's very flat, there's room for the fabric to sit. So here's a flat button. And when you sew it on, you normally would think, well, I'm just going to sew that on. However, if you sew it on tight without a shaft, there's nowhere for your fabric to fit. The buttonhole has to force its way in. And what that does is that puts a lot of pressure on the thread and puts a lot of pressure on the fabric, because it will rip right through the fabric and you might have a hole come through the fabric, or if you're lucky you would only have the threads break. So it's very important that you leave room for the fabric to fit underneath. And to do that, you can add a shaft. Now adding a shaft is as easy as doing the sewing with a toothpick or something to raise it, so that when you stitch this down and you take the toothpick out, you see now you have the space for the fabric to fit inside. And that's why the buttons with the shafts are a lot easier to sew, because they have the built-in spot for the fabric to go. Now here are a couple ideas of what you can use to make that space or that shaft. A very simple sewing pin will work if your fabric is very fine and you don't need a lot of space. And then you can go up in a size, and these are pins that florists use. Toothpicks are probably the most common thing to use, and they do have a nice shaft on them. It's a very good size for most fabric. This is also a tapestry needle, and you can use the tapestry needle. And this is still a tapestry needle, but it's a little bit thinner. So any of these will work so that that button can be raised a little bit off the surface. Now threads are also another important thing to consider. This thread here is called a button carpet thread. And this is also a very heavy thread that is used for buttons. Here is 100% cotton, quilting cotton, and this is 100% thread. This is actually used to top stitch denim with. You can use your heavy cotton, pearl cotton, And then you have a very heavy nylon. Now keep in mind, when you decide on the thread you're going to use, the thread cannot be so strong it can rip the button out of the fabric. So it's good to stick with something that is equally the same strength as your fabric. Now, hand sewing needles. The most important thing, of course, is to make sure you have enough room in the eye to put the thread. The other thing you need is a good sharp point. So any needle that you have that will fit your thread is the needle you can use. So if it's a button that needs to be replaced, a lot of times you'll be able to see the wear from where the button was before. If not, just close the garment as if it had already had the button on. Now, where are you going to put the mark? Well, let's explain that. This part of the buttonhole is made so the button can fit through. The end here is where the button is going to rest, so that is where you need to sew the button. There on the other side, not over here. Just take something and make a mark, and you're ready to go. So here are the pair of pants that are in question that need the button sewn on them. And you can see the thickness here of this fabric. And I am going to be using a flat button. So I need to have the built-in shaft. So how big am I going to need the shaft? I'm going to need it the thickness of the buttonhole. The toothpick would work really well because it's about the same thickness as the fabric. Now there's a single strand in here, but the ends have been tied together, and I'm going to trim off these tails after that knot. So my thread's knotted, I'm ready to go. The first thing I'm going to do is just take a little stitch right where my mark is. And I'm going to pull through until I get just before the end. And I'm going to put my needle through that loop and pull it tight. So I have already anchored that. Now with that little spot you've made, you're able to put your toothpick in. And you can tighten it there. So that toothpick is going to stay nice and secure, so it's not going to flop all over the place for you. And now I'm going to just go up to one hole, and I'm going to go down to the next. And then I'm just going to go on the other side of the toothpick and pull the thread tight. Straighten it up. Now I'm able to come back up here in the back. So I'm going to be able to put that needle right in the first hole that I had the first time, which was this one. And tighten it. Go down again and go through the same hole, or pretty close where you were the last time. And you're just going to continue doing this. Now, keeping the toothpick there, I'm just going to sew back and forth, I would say maybe 4 times. Because I am using the heavier thread. If you're not going to use the heavier thread, then do it a little bit more. Now, if this button had just the 2 holes, I would stop here and I would come through to the front again, but not go through the button. And I'm going to come out. And then I'm going to tie it off. Now the tying off will be the same as with the 4. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to come up through the new hole. And again, I'm going to go down, keeping the toothpick in the center. So I've stitched the button on. Now I can remove this toothpick. And you can see that the button is raised off of the surface. So now the pants will be able to fit in there. Now the next thing you can do is circle the button, and that will help strengthen the shaft. Now you need to knot it. So to tie a knot, just stab through your fabric and leave a little bit of a loop here. Now with this loop, you're going to put your needle in and pull. That will make a knot. But I would recommend doing it twice. Now you can bury this thread. Bring it out, and you'll snip right there. There's room there, so that when the button goes on, it doesn't pull. So tying off is the same way if you've had the single or the double holes. I'm so glad you could join me today on part 1 on how to sew on buttons. Now that my husband has his pants, we're all set to go. Join me again next week when we're going to cover how to stitch those buttons on by machine, and we'll cover how to sew just those buttons that already have the pre-built-in shafts. Thanks for joining me. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.